Our second speaker is Professor Santosh Naronha, who obtained his bachelor's in chemical engineering from IIT Madras and a PhD in biochemical engineering from the University of Maryland. He was then employed as a postdoc fellow for several years at the NIH in the US, and he has been at IIT Bombay as a faculty since 2001. He is a biochemical engineer by training who has evolved multidisciplinary interests. He has focused on understanding various metabolic and regulatory aspects of microbial systems towards rationally manipulating their productivity using genetic engineering techniques for production of therapeutics. He is also the professor in charge of the Tata Center for Technology and Design, and which is an interdisciplinary center with a focus on creating solutions with high social impact. Among other activities, he also coordinates the development and deployment of virtual labs, which is an MOE-funded project. Okay, over to Santosh.
Yeah, thanks all, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me for this creativity and innovation event, which gives me an opportunity to explain some of the things that we do at the Tata Center, which itself requires a bit of an introduction because I recognize a number of faces here who probably are not too familiar with our activities. The center, which was started in 2014 with funding from the Tata Trust, with the objective of going after problems of social importance. So, in some ways, our funding model, the Tata Trust, who obviously have been funding huge amounts of funding to NGOs directly on the ground in terms of social impact, starting to ask the question as to whether there is better impact to be achieved by routing some of their funds into a research entity, creating custom solutions which then are deployed again by their original partners on the ground, thereby scaling impact. And some ways can these solutions be prototyped and tried out in an Indian context and then deployed elsewhere in the world. So again, in many ways, the ambition of some of these foundations has been steadily growing into creating impact, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also increasingly in Africa. So when the Tata Trust looked into potentially engaging on these, they first approached MIT, and the first Tata Center for Technology and Design was created at MIT. And they very quickly realized that there are certain bottlenecks with achieving scalable impact. Fundamentally, American students are available to us on the ground in India only for a couple of months in a year. And so social impact is limited unless you spend a huge amount of time trying to understand challenges on the ground and custom deriving appropriate solutions. And so then they approached IIT Bombay and asked for a second center to be instituted. Initially as a sister center, but increasingly with a focus on developing our own agenda, both in terms of research themes, but ultimately also in terms of coursework. And as far as I know, from the Indian context, this was probably the first ever interdisciplinary center which had the funding to engage in terms of both seed and translation activities and social impact. Probably the first ever center which was given a grant and told, go find challenges and then attempt to solve them entirely on your own, as opposed to being told to work in specific teams, which in hindsight in an engineering entity like ours or an engineering dominant entity like ours has meant certain challenges. So let me give you a certain sense of what the teams were. So we had this ambition of exploring and developing solutions that would ultimately have focus on affordability. So the broad intent was to create solutions which would apply to, let's say, the bottom 500 million of the population. But again, just because your bottom half don't give them necessarily an inferior solution. So create highly performing solutions, custom create these, and then in fact work the other way around and see whether you can leverage further profit at the top of the pyramid. And in many ways, sectors that you look at mirrored the kinds of funding models that the Tata Trust had. They had internally verticals on agriculture and food, education, energy, healthcare, and so on. And so the idea was that we would strike up conversations with their managers on the ground and custom create solutions. Our response to this challenge was to create a three-part solution, try to develop coursework, because this element of what is social impact required us to understand social challenges. And again, as engineers predominantly and now increasingly with a focus on technology and design on campus. Right? Our understanding of societal issues is pretty weak. We do have a humanities component, but that's predominantly in some kind of a service mode to the engineering discipline, at least it was in 2014. And therefore, this element of figuring out what to solve was relatively weak, and we needed to get into some kind of an academic mode where we could debate solutions. So we created two post-seminar courses which ran through the School of Management, where we debated needs. I'll come to this point about the need in a bit. But having defined the need, what's an appropriate solution also became an issue. Given that as a virtual center, we had the freedom to recruit faculty and students from across the institute to work on a specific challenge. We quickly realized that we needed some kind of lab infrastructure to support a diverse set of projects. So we essentially put together a fab lab, which is on the ground floor of the lecture hall complex. And then we started offering field visits and internship and workshops so that students could benefit in terms of not just understanding these as theoretical challenges, but actually get onto the ground, including get onto the ground at locations far away in the country, and better understand what needed to be done. So the Yatra, for example, as an activity that Tata Fellows could engage in. We started offering fellowships to master's and PhD students to engage on these problems. And these typically were mapped onto projects which are also going to be given grants to execute. So we set up an internal research funding stream where faculty members were incentivized into floating challenges, and then based on the appropriateness of what was likely to happen, both in terms of satisfying needs, but also in terms of scaling a solution, the thought was to provide seed funding, and then critically to also offer translation funding, because most innovative efforts die because you get onto a government funding cycle where you usually don't have continuity of funding, and then teams fall apart, and the solution, therefore, starts to languish. The lab that we built got into also assisting various research teams as they started putting together solutions, and all in all, over the last 10 years now, we've funded more than 100 projects, and several of these have gone on to large-scale translation. And these are across the spectrum of devices, materials, and processes. I'm going to describe a few of these so you get a feel for the range of challenges that they encompass. But before that, as a process, the typical challenge for any funding agency is to identify a series of challenges, problems as we call them, and then essentially start throwing small sums of money at them. And as proofs of concept start turning up and show limited amount of impact, you then start asking them to scale their deployment in terms of pilots. Larger scale funding is made available. And all of this with a clear intent of trying to understand whether the solution is ultimately going to be useful on the ground and can scale. So I'm going to keep talking about three variables or three elements of this in the subsequent slides. What are the problems? Right? Where do these originate as challenges? And what is their continued relevance as time goes on and as we keep working on harder problems? So for example, you just heard there's an example of prosthetics in the previous talk where one particular challenge has essentially been looked at over a very long time scale, 15 to 20 years, and that's when you start seeing some impact emerge. And that's a bit of a challenge for an academic entity which is put under pressure to create solutions, because the donors typically are not willing to wait 15 to 20 years. Right? So how do you then figure out the continued relevance of whatever it is you initiate as a program and as a funding track? Second, who are the set of people who work on these? Between faculty, between students, between project staff. Who works on these problems and what are their incentives to work on? What invariably are going to be very hard problems. So the moment you say something's a social impact problem, right, odds are that it's going to take you a while before you achieve a good solution, which might find value to somebody who then turns into an investor and then offers a certain sum of money and stabilizes your livelihood. Right? So therefore, who is championing these causes? And at some level, this, in a retrospective kind of mode, we've got to ask the question, what's the role of an institute or academia in trying to tackle such situations with people accessible to them? And finally, where does funding for these sorts of work come from? And while the institute, let's say the Tata Trust funding was capable of seed funding certain activities, how do these continue for timescales of 10 years? Who funds them? And at some point, what is an exit strategy? Is this a for-profit activity? or is it just a public good which universities engage in creating? And so three elements: people, idea, and fund in all that we do. So broadly, in the first phase of our existence, where funding was plentiful, the question boiled down to, as an internal community being given the chance, probably for the first ever time in an Indian context, of being asked to go work on hard problems, where we have the funding, we can define the problem, we can define the solution, we can execute pilots, and we can scale. We tried a model of asking faculty members as PI-driven projects to both pose problems, but also propose potential solutions. And I'll describe a few of these as we go along. So some of you are familiar with major outcomes. For example, we had teams in the biosciences department, bioengineering department, create solutions in digital microscopy. And as an application, some of this then found its way into, for example, handling sickle cell disease, diagnosing sickle cell disease. We're probably all familiar with the CAR T-cell solution which has come out of IIT Bombay, and in its early stages it needed to be seed funded by the Tata Center and other agencies on campus in trying to keep what ultimately now is a for-profit solution going for a while before it could receive a very large grant from the government. Because that's what a solution of this sort, and the problem, if you're not familiar with, was how do you come up with a personalized therapy for solving certain types of cancers. And it turns out to be an expensive solution as a personalized solution. And that in turn, working backwards, requires a very large grant to set up infrastructure to come up with an expensive solution. And beyond a point, the government was only possible sponsor for such activity. You had one project on looking at bone reconstruction, that's related to what you just heard. But in this case, the challenge was to come up with a graded porosity of bone so that you could have it, for example, as a jaw reconstruction process. Right? And again, how do you take the risk out of such a thing where the engineering gets sorted out, leave alone the subsequent steps as you've heard in the previous talk of what it takes to pilot it and then get to the point where you get manufacturing approvals. And so these are somewhat more conventional projects which quickly map onto engineering departments on campus. But then you've got something like jaggery manufacture, where jaggery manufacture is a cottage industry. And essentially very little technology goes into the manufacture of jaggery. And now this challenge is how do you, assuming you want to convert it into something which is a fairly large-scale process, how do you create some kind of a mechanism by which you bring in appropriate, in this case, the key element of jaggery making is evaporating water away from cane juice. So how do you bring in the appropriate heat transfer design? It's a mechanical engineering solution at the end of the day. But then how do you also figure out how to use the solution on site? The real challenge is how do you provide value by having a mobile setup for making jaggery, which goes to the farmer, as opposed to the farmer having to bring his cane to a central jaggery making location. Right? And then what happens to the jaggery once made? What's the supply chain, and who picks up the produce, and who's incentivized, therefore, into something which is of a very standard quality as a produce? Right? So these things all start off as gadgets of some kind, they start off as technologies of some kind, and very quickly this element of what is the ecosystem into which they're going to fit, and what is the value add for all the stakeholders in that ecosystem. And at this point, again, you're forced into defining these pretty quickly as the engineering starts to turn robust. We also had a solution for looking at hearing defects. So tinnitus is when you have a ringing sound in your ears, you develop a hearing damage. And so how do you detect it? And then how do you counter it by essentially cancelling out that noise by sending audio signals and provide relief to patients and so on. So this, for example, out of electrical engineering, this happened in chemical engineering, this in chemical engineering as well, and both of these in bio. But then we have got other solutions in the energy and waste management sectors. For example, how do you come up with materials which can, as opposed to water-based reagents, use polymers so that you can punch up roof tiles and use this in remote locations. So therefore, right? Or use it, for example, even in scooters or cycles. How do you generate silver paste locally? And something as trivial as silver paste is something we continue to import. And there's a huge demand for this, for example, with solar photovoltaics. So there's a need for local technologies for creating silver paste so that you can then screen print solar panels. Waste sand So a lot of sand increasingly as we start getting into manufacture of various things, automotive manufacture in particular, and then that sand is essentially thrown away or discarded after one single cycle of molding a metal. And given that sand is a depleting resource, how do you now regenerate sand? Right? And there's value add there, a huge amount of value add if you can figure out how to do it. Essentially knocking off metallic components into, and then essentially reclaiming waste sand. Cool coatings, creating materials which are better reflective of heat, but also sound. One of the things which, again, most of us would not think too much about, but which came to us as a challenge from Dharavi, of all places, was that slum dwellers who are under tin roofs really struggle with sound during the monsoon. Right? And something as simple as materials to dampen some of this would provide some extent of relief. We've had challenges in the water domain. So looking at solutions for reclaiming more water. So a typical reverse osmosis system, for example, discards 50% of the water you input into it. And therefore, in states such as Rajasthan and so on, where you don't have access to enough drinking water in the first place, is there a way to leverage the waste 50% and recover more water from it? And that now involves a process of humidification, dehumidification, which basically is you heating a stream of air over a panel, basically mimicking the rain cloud system. So basically you humidify at one extreme, generate the cloud which goes to a different extreme and deposits water, so you condense water. And you leverage that cycle and in the process desalinate. But if you can do this using solar energy or some other waste form of energy, you actually have the ability to now recover a lot of water from contaminated groundwater and use that on top of an RO membrane system to generate and supply more drinking water. So this was something which is literally sitting on top of mechanical engineering as a pilot and is now rolling out at a large scale in a village north of Bangalore. So what's common to all of these is all of these are problems defined by a faculty member as a challenge, and then the faculty member is responsible for recruiting a student, a master's or a PhD student. But as the project and idea gains momentum, very quickly the team realizes they need support staff. And at this point, the additional staffers who have to be recruited, which implies a fund requirement. Right? And depending on the skill set, sometimes you need multiple skill sets to now be onboarded onto this particular initial team, which is starting to resemble a startup, but a startup within the IT system as opposed to outside. And you need to continue to drive development of the product. And then separately, you need some people starting to look at what this might mean when you actually take it outside and achieve some level of outreach in a pilot. So that's where it also turned out very clearly that the center had a role beyond simply offering funding. So we needed to have the ability to understand projects and then provide outreach to each of the investigators involved and help them with their pilots to the extent they needed centralized assistance. Right? And fundamentally where it goes is within the academic system. It's very hard for individual faculty to build huge teams and go after multiple facets of a single problem. Some of these went on to get internal funding, but then some of these very clearly it became obvious that they were not going to survive without a large infusion of external funding, in which case, again, to make sure that the initial effort doesn't die off, the center had to step in and create mechanisms by which we could locate additional large grants. Let me pivot to talking about a couple of case studies where one of the challenges that now happens as we execute these projects and get into some level of systematic focused intervention on the ground is that a thought process starts being moved away from our initial goals. So the original challenge for cancer screening comes to us, again, the connect is always for us Tata Memorial in the city. And around 2014 was also a point in time when the institute decided to focus on healthcare research and created systems for that. And the Tata Memorial Hospital, among others, was a major partner identified to pose challenges to the engineers. And one of the challenges was try and cut down on the number of people visiting the hospitals for some kind of screening activity. So oral, breast, and cervical cancer are the major cancers that women struggle with. And so one of the things here was, could you screen people? Cut down the screening time, could you create low-cost screening solutions? We picked cervical cancer because of all the cancers, this was the most ignored cancer. And it resulted finally in a solution that we call Gynecam. But by the way, this is the third iteration of a solution. The first iteration was a pathology-based attempt to figure out whether women had a potential lesion on the cervix. That involved taking a scraping of tissue from the cervix and then looking at it under a microscope. But as we built the solution, and we started building that solution, and as we built it, we quickly realized that there aren't enough pathologists in the country to review all the smears that are going to be collected to do this. So that's not a workable solution simply because the human resource is not there. So the tech has to be different in terms of design. The second solution is something that we're all familiar with thanks to COVID now. But back in 2014 was not an obvious solution, an RT-PCR. So cervical cancer is caused by a virus, and you can test for a virus by probing for its DNA, and RT-PCR does it. Again, you take a scraping of tissue, and then you leverage that to come up with a test result. You need a PCR machine, so it's gadget intensive. But more importantly, as we again went down that road of building a solution, and we engineers, the moment somebody places a problem in front of us, you jump and build the solution. But as you build the solution, you realize the cost per screen, anytime you're using a wet lab solution, and PCR involves bioreagents, and these are expensive, the cost per screen is high. And therefore, this is not a viable screening process, especially if you're screening in the interior of the country. And you're waiting for somebody to come up with a fund to even screen women. Right? So, in many ways, therefore, the technical specifications of what a solution should be are given to us wrong. The problem definition is go screen for cervical cancer. But the problem definition is usually told to us along with the solution embedded in the problem statement itself, which is go screen for cervical cancer using an RT-PCR, or go screen for cervical cancer using a pap smear-based solution, a pathology-based solution, when neither of those are going to be viable as actual social impact solutions long term. Right? And this is an example that we now use in our coursework where we differentiate a need from a problem. The need is screening for cervical cancer, and why? Because we've got such a large population which, as it is, only approaches a healthcare specialist when something's really escalated and is a late stage condition. And usually outcomes are very poor when it's already a late stage condition. Therefore, something like cervical cancer, which is a preventable cancer, it has to be dealt with very early on, which now means it has to be screened very early on, which then means that you've got to screen for it where the women are, because nobody is willingly going to walk up to a tertiary care center to get screened. Right? And this in turn implies that a tech solution has to be in the hands of a paramedic somewhere in the interior. And when you now reason it this way, you realize that the only thing which works is an imaging solution. So, multiple iterations, but finally we are around the phone, simply because the cheapest way to buy a set of optics these days is to buy the phone and discard the rest of the phone. Right? And so the phone, then a training model, we actually had to create training material. Why? Because in the hands of paramedics, most paramedics have no clue what the cervix is. Leave alone screening for cervical cancer. And so at some point, what started as a tech problem became an awareness problem. How do you train people to screen for cervical cancer? And once you do this, there's a market for your solutions. In other words, we're creating a market in the first place. Right? So you do this, and it turns out, by the way, that if you stain the cervix with either iodine or acetic acid, you can accentuate a lesion, you can highlight a lesion, and it's more easily obvious. So we built this, we make copies of it because phones are cheap. At the end of the day, the phone has to be protected because remember there's a viral infection and you don't want the phone itself to start transmitting a virus from patient to patient when it's used for the screening context. You need something which can be wiped down and sterilized. And when we go back and look at this, both need and solution kept shifting on us over time. And at this point, we realized that the biggest impact is because we've created a training module. We've gone and told other stakeholders, especially in rural India, what it takes to put together screening camps. You can't just put together screening camps because when you run screening camps, you're going to find women with problems and you can't abandon them. So there's an ethical obligation that you then figure out a way to escalate that case to hospital. And now you're responsible for care as in the therapy for that particular patient. So now there's a fund implication to offer therapy to those positive cases that you find. which implies that a larger set of stakeholders quickly have to become part of the whole deployment of this if you are going to achieve outcome. And that finally is you creating a playbook and essentially packaging that as a policy outcome. So somebody else has to adopt this as a game plan, and that's us building the gadgets, that's us creating incentives for others to be part of the process, and us essentially acting as catalysts, bringing a set of people to a table to even focus on it. And in some ways, as the same story you heard in the previous talk, where when you persevere with these problems, a set of other stakeholders who can finance things or open doors slowly come around and find value in getting you going onto this. We've learned, interestingly, that it's possible to keep large teams going, and that's simply because when you hit upon what is a clear need, in this case, rural women, if you think about it in villages, very often don't get access to healthcare. And so, conversely, the funding agencies therefore wanted solutions targeted towards women. That meant we had hit upon something that would be things which funders would fund. We just needed to put together on a systematic game plan for deployment of this, and then the funds come your way, you just need to keep teams going. And the focus has to shift, right? The need has to be correctly defined. And by the way, at this point, after having run large programs in the Kutch, for example, we don't see as much cervical cancer as the theory said we would see. Right? And now you have a different challenge, which is what's the economics of going out and screening for women and hunting for cervical cancer when you find that they have a large number of other indications which impact their health, reproductive health. For example, they've got fungal infections, they've got bacterial infections, and they've got other conditions. So this then morphs into what's a comprehensive problem when it comes to screening for reproductive tract infections as a more holistic challenge. What's the basket of problems you are therefore going to screen when you probably will get only one crack at screening that village woman, because it's an effort to drag her out of her house onto a screening camp and spend a whole day. Potentially she loses wages when she does that. When you therefore screen, what's the basket of things that you screen, and what should the engineering solution therefore provide? And it goes beyond cervical cancer. One other thing that we've learned as part of this, and that's also important for an institute like ours, is how appropriate is this solution? So when we built the imaging device, the idea was we would stain the cervix and then use machine learning to identify lesions, especially the early onset lesions, where you see tiny features of an image. Right? And image processing and machine learning are things that we do a lot of on campus. We added such functionality, but the moment we put this gadget with such functionality in the hands of nurses and midwives, ASHA workers and ANMs, the next thing that happened was the ASHA worker proceeded to become a gynec, or behave like a gynec, and proceed to offer the woman a therapy without any controls on what she was going to do to the patient. And in many ways, we actually created tech which had the potential to harm a woman in the field. We withdrew the image processing element in a hurry, and instead we morphed it into a telemedicine kind of story. Make sure that the imagery is captured, but make sure an expert is somewhere in the loop to review what can happen. Because if you let paramedics pretend to be doctors, there's no harm that you're creating. And in many ways, tech that we create in the hands of novices is us creating quacks of all kinds. There's a second project of a similar nature, just to give you a sense that we do things other than health. So this is with Preeti Rao and Nagesh. Nagesh is an tech student in electrical engineering. This has to do with evaluating the fluency of speech in school kids, and ideas to, especially with primary school kids, 3rd, 4th and 5th standard, get the kid to read a paragraph of text out loud, capture the audio, and then start doing signal processing on the audio to figure out where are the hesitations, where are the pauses, which are the mispronounced words. And you can totally take away the drudgery of evaluating fluency of speech. And early on, especially when you're looking at languages like English, which for most kids in India is not the first language. Okay, if you're trying to gauge proficiency, there is a connection between fluency and comprehension. And so there aren't education tech models which understand these well. And so therefore, the process of trying to take away the drudgery of evaluation and the subjectivity of evaluation, because it's all done manually right now by school teachers. Go away from that model to automate it and then to bring in some level of quality, and in the longer term, rather than think of this as a diagnostic which identifies mistakes in speech, but rather therapeutic, which allows for a kid to practice and improve their reading fluency, was a objective, and we funded this project as a seed-funded project. So essentially, this is signal processing at its heart. You collect a waveform, and you can start figuring out where are the hesitations. And then when you do higher order signal processing, you essentially can figure out things about intonation and expression. And all of this can get into a report card. And you do a control study. This was done with KV Sangathan. Helps that we have a KV on campus. And there are a large number of students. And the correlation is okay. Okay, so it turns out that the automated process works very well relative to a manual process. And essentially the promise here is that you entirely take out the drudgery of this. Now, the basic core idea therefore works. Question is, how does such a thing achieve large-scale impact, and who therefore runs this as a program long-term? So there's a research team which has done this. What's the value add now of the research team continuing to work on this? But you have to move into some kind of a deployment model where you stop doing the R&D, and that, again, for us academics is not as appealing. Right? So what's the enterprise solution for this? Right? What features does this need? And one of the things we have very quickly learned is don't simply talk about a diagnostic, because the last thing we want to do is to go into schools and tell kids what they cannot do, because that's ultimately going to harm the students. So how does this flip into some kind of a therapeutic solution where you're allowing kids to practice and you've got an automated way of evaluating the speech so that they achieve, therefore, better fluency in speech. But then this question of abuse again. Because we've got data, we're creating dashboards, we're creating a sense of outcomes. So the next thing you know is, if you walk into a classroom and then evaluate all the kids there, you've created some level of scoring of the cohort of students in a class, and this can backfire on the teacher. Where if it turns out the classroom is the set of kids are not doing well, this can really backfire on the teacher. So therefore, what are the guardrails on anything that we do? Because while we're going with the best of intentions as our initial prototype designs, the question is what, when it ends up in the hands of other personnel as a deployment, what can happen? So these are things where we say we take the solution back, we probably need to rework this, so these are going to be under some level of safeguards. And we don't simply put this out there and don't commercialize this straight away, because from a societal sense, they can be a bigger problem created than a solution. So again, the point to bring out here is it's for an academic entity to sit and debate all facets of this, for which an interdisciplinary kind of effort is required. And you don't simply create tech and you push it out there and you don't expect people to adopt it. And while most people out there are fascinated with the kinds of things that we do, there are lots of dangers because they don't understand the implications of what we do. Another element of what happens when you figure out what you're working on is wrong. This is a disease called Hirschsprung's, and in Hirschsprung's, children are born without nerve endings in some chunk of the small intestine. It's a developmental disorder, it's a genetic disorder. And the immediate impact of this is the child is unable to pass through. So the day after birth, you think of it as constipation, but as time goes on, it's definitely not constipation, and then there's a certain amount of alarm. And the bottleneck in here is that, therefore, if you really want to figure out what's going on and that you've lost nerve activity, and therefore you don't have motility in the gut, the only way to figure this out is for a surgeon to go in and collect biopsy samples at various depths into the small intestine, which for a newborn is a fairly nasty thing to do. And even worse, if you take these biopsy samples and look at them under a microscope and you realize they lack nerves, the only solution is to cut off this chunk of the small intestine and reattach the rest to the rectum. It is a hugely difficult call to take. And something like this, and we've got many conditions like this in the country, something like this is a relatively rare condition, therefore not routinely taught, and we might have 100 pathologists in the country who know what they're doing when it comes to diagnosing. Right? And the pathologist we were working with routinely was getting samples from all the way, like Sri Lanka, Nepal, and so on. So there's a lack of expertise when it comes to dealing with a diagnosis of this, and outcomes for kids are therefore extremely poor. What happens is the biopsy samples are collected, converted into paraffin blocks, and shipped all the way to the pathologist in a metro, because the pathologist will not go to a rural location. So the sample has to come to the pathologist, and the turnaround for a report can be a month, which obviously leads to a very poor quality of life for the kid involved. So the question was, can you solve this using pathology, some digital pathology? Can you digitize and push some data across so that the physical sample doesn't have to go up and down. And that's basically taking a biopsy sample and scanning the whole biopsy sample. Why? Because there isn't a pathologist to sit and stare at one particular element on site. So instead, by default, you have to take the whole tissue, and like you do with a Google map, you create a high resolution Google map, even though you and I are interested only in looking at one corner of the map. So the whole thing has to go across to somebody who can then review chunks of it and then make a call. So you need a scanner, and then you need an interface which allows for data to go up and come down to the pathologist, wherever the pathologist is. That's the best use of the pathologist's time. But this element of the solution being appropriate. So while we spent a huge amount of effort on this and funding on this, at some point a different group took these tissue samples and created an enzyme-based kit to come up with a colorimetric reaction, so converted it basically into a chemistry problem. And it turns out there's a different way to crack the same problem. And now this chemistry problem as a kit is the sort of thing which can be deployed in all kinds of hospitals, and essentially the surgeons, technicians can themselves pull off the test. There's no need to have a digital infrastructure there. What's an appropriate solution? And this sets up an interesting thing. When you get onto these problems, we jump onto it with all the super specializations that we have. We spend some time thinking about the diversity of lines of attack that we can come up with, and then work out the most appropriate solution. And we're usually guilty of wanting to be part of an interesting story, which also means that we are guilty of inflicting our super specializations onto a particular intervention when it might be totally unnecessary. One element about funding, still up. Okay, I'll wrap this up. Yeah. So, one element about funding. So, how do we tackle these as they get really interesting and require larger scales of funding? So, this solution about water purification that we came up with and was seed funded internally probably cost us internally about 12 lakhs. But when we started getting into large scale implementations at a village, this now needed an order of 2 crores. And the government got interested, BST got interested, and BST offered a grant. But with our GFR rules and other things, and we've got a dean here, I can comment on that later, our funding processes and our fund handling processes essentially force us to innovate with one hand tied behind our back. And I would say that approximately 50% of the funding that's given to us is unusable, and has to therefore come through now a parallel route, a donation-based route, where we have flexibility in terms of how we spend. And this is a challenge. So as we try to figure out ways by which we scale impact without a dependency on government process. Government process, of course, are what they are as a function of time scales, the fund cycles, also the scales, pay and so on and so on. That's where it's become extremely important for us to take on projects through a range of potential donors and then leverage. I'll skip a whole bunch of slides for lack of time, but one of the things that's happened, I didn't give you the 1.5 story. It's not a 2.0 because we're still waiting for the funds for the next phase of data center to come in. But in the interim, what we have done is trying to reverse the fund flow rather than us burning our funding on projects all the time, on other people's ideas all the time. We've also been taking external challenges, agencies like UNICEF and so on, asking us to create solutions which convert into global goods effectively. And that's an interesting kind of space for us to be in as a university, where there are agencies interested in us developing solutions as long as we will give away the intellectual property and allow others to commercialize. So effectively function in what was called the scientific commons kind of mode, and people willing to offer stability in terms of our existence as long as our innovation teams are willing to work on all kinds of challenges, digital, device, and so on. UNICEF, obviously, its mandate is children, so things to do with child health, whether it is a diagnostic device or whether it's data. And effectively, building teams within the IT system and functioning in a mode where we can take on hard challenges and execute them in mission mode style, which is also roughly what the BETIC story itself is, which is to create different portfolios within one system and then collectively try to go after the hard problem. And that's what it takes to work on what are ultimately wicked problems. You don't attack them with a single skill set, you don't attack them with a single source of funds, you don't attack them with one idea, you try many versions of a particular solution at the same time, and then the winning idea ought to win, which fundamentally, ultimately implies a huge tolerance for risk at all levels. A risk at the innovators level, a risk for the students involved, So a lot of these, almost all of these involved a student, but invariably needed to be continued or carried forward using project staffers as champions. The students obviously with placement at some point have huge contradictions in terms of what they can do. In fact, it's actually a surprise that we got this far at all if you think about it in terms of social innovation, given that most of society sends students into the IT Bombay system to escape society. Right? And very few of the students who come in, therefore, are keen to go back and solve problems on the ground. Because it's more a way for the family, immediate family, and in some cases, extended family to escape their immediate limitations that they have. So, in many ways, therefore, this is an interesting outcome as to an experiment which is 10 years in the making and will hopefully continue. I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.